Hello class, I'm Eric Richter, and this week we will be reviewing an article entitled Using Synthetic Phonics to Improve Listening Awareness and Accuracy in Pre-Intermediate Learners. This was published in the journal entitled Cambridge English Research Notes, issue number 61, published in August 2015 by Adam Scott. Now, as a heads up, Adam's research did not go exactly as he planned. But I did find his research still applicable. Here is his outline. Scott's article used the following outline. He began with the introduction, which gave some background to his purposes engaging in the study, as well as some definitions that readers might need. He then gave some information on his school, including the population, age, and classroom formats for his whole school. During his introduction paragraphs, he did discuss a little bit of his literature review, but he mainly left this, he did not go into extensive detail in the actual write-up for his literature review. His participants were then listed, describing a breakdown between each cycle in his research, which he goes on to describe in the methodology section. He goes into great detail in the methodology section, discussing the cycles involved for his findings, and offers a discussion of his findings, and which provide some interpretation of the data. As he discusses his interpretations, he offers questions that were raised as a result of his study, and self-critiques himself quite a bit to extrapolate any meaning, and finally concludes by posing some reflections for his action research process, as well as reflections on the outcomes. In his research, Scott integrated synthetic phonics, or SP as he refers to it throughout his article, as a teaching approach into listening and vocabulary lessons to investigate its effect on student listening accuracy or awareness. Scott felt that the phonics aspect of language development was largely ignored in the classroom and wanted to work to resolve this. He did provide some definitions as to synthetic phonics and some of his processes, but did not go into great detail as to what he would be doing on a day-to-day process with his class. Synthetic phonics uses varied common spellings for identified phonemes to more explicitly draw attention to sounds. Other strategies for raising phonemic awareness did not address the problems that Scott saw, particularly strategies that pertained to English as a second or as a foreign language. So these were some common issues with strategies for raising listening awareness. Variation in letter-sound correspondences. So in English we may have multiple letter combinations that can come up with the same sound when written. We all know how confusing that can be. The additional burden of using phonemic scripts like the IPA, which actually make it even more difficult for learners because they have to learn a new code or something to use outside of what they're actually going to be using, which is very ineffective. I think Scott did actually run into similar issues with this in his own research, despite trying to avoid it. And then finally, connected and natural speech. Many listening awareness processes use natural speech, which can be too quick and not correspondent to actual speech used in the classroom, which is typically slower and able to be stopped and asked to help with perception. Because these other methods did not directly solve Scott's perceived problems, he borrowed a synthetic phonics from general pedagogy, which was traditionally used to help English-speaking children rather than ESL and EFL learners with phonemic awareness. Scott described his context at his school in Brighton. He spent 2 years working with high-level students at St. Giles International Language School, who still struggled with unnatural speech production, both in pronunciation and in grammatical forms. He attributed these difficulties to listening skills, which can act as a tributary to other language issues. If they're not comprehending the sounds, then grammar is a moot point. His context was then applied with his researchers, who were not high level, they were low, intermediate, or pre-intermediate learners, as we will see. As a result of the context and his background with these students, Scott had 3 questions emerge. Scott offered these questions. If learners were able to decode and notice more of the natural speech all around them, would this become input and help learners' language align with natural English that they will hear? Was the inability to decode spoken English a factor in learners plateauing at intermediate levels? And could synthetic phonics that he uses effectively with the ESL beginner literacy also have uses beyond beginner level? And once again, these were pre-intermediate students, which we will see in a moment. His participants were of a varied age between 18 and 48 years old, quite a divide, with an average of 25 years old. Students came from varied language backgrounds, including French, Swiss German, Korean, Chinese, and Arabic backgrounds. And they, I suppose, were in an ESL location, being in Brighton. He had many students drop out during the course of his study, which deterred from him receiving really great results. And he had students that dropped out of his study but remained in the classroom, and he would just disallow their results from being included in the data that was analyzed. So he broke it down into 2 cycles, and in cycle 1 he started with 11 students and ended with 6, and in cycle 2 he began with 8 students and ended up with 5. I do believe there were also a great deal more women in his class than men, being like 10 women and 1 man in cycle 1 or something like that. In Scott's study, he used 2 4-week cycles with different classes at the pre-intermediate level using a mixed methods design. Scott used qualitative research to pre-test his students on listening accuracy before engaging in the study. He also used 2 questionnaires to first report on their own internal listening processes and self-perception regarding listening ability in different environments in Brighton. The first questionnaire was used before the cycle began, and the second questionnaire in post to evaluate potential changes in habits and perceptions. Much of this was weighted against their own perceptions on listening ability, and that really affected the findings that he had. In between the cycles, Scott used a reflection survey to determine what might need to change between cycles to improve his research. And he did make some changes in cycle 2 based on these reflections. And as a result, he also was playing catch up to create material to go through, and this made the tasks even more repetitive. Findings demonstrated that there was indeed a need for teaching of listening to improve ability to recognize natural speech. Unfortunately, his findings also presented that despite students believing that they had increased listening skills, synthetic phonics did not demonstrate an increase in listening awareness, showing negative findings. So the student perceptions actually contradicted what results he did find, which is very discouraging. As demonstrated by the drop-off of students and student attitudes towards the teaching strategies that he employed, Scott found that boredom was a major barrier to his success. And in the future, he would involve more interactive strategies. As previously mentioned, he did find that students needed improved listening skills and that the research is actually necessary. So he will be continuing with this research, just changing his methods and hopefully getting a larger sample size as well to work with. Many of Scott's remarks in his reflection stage indicate that his results were, in fact, ineffective, but he will be revisiting the study with a more informed perspective. In the future, he hopes to develop a better formal assessment tool for his student achievement, and also will be looking back at perception differences and hopefully helping students recognize that their perception is rather weak and that it is worthwhile to work on. He did find that students were at the end more aware of the need to pay attention to their listening ability and try to work on improving that. Scott also would be including more interactive activities to keep students from being bored and losing interest. And hopefully we'll look at different perspectives for improving listening awareness, to use more strategies and see if others will work as well. That's what I would hope to see from him. So my critique of Scott's style. As for Scott's style, he was very clear in the organization of his presentation. He included subheadings to break down his introduction, contexts, methodology, each cycle, and his findings. The only main missing elements that I found were that his literature review really could have been more inclusive of various perspectives and gone a little deeper rather than just scraping the surface. I'm not sure what he went into on his own. Just in the literature he provided, it was somewhat vague and difficult to follow without really digging in. He also could have used a larger sample size to take a more reliable data set. With Scott's very small classes and only going through 2 cycles, and this was continuously in flux because he was revising his material, I think he needed to have a more solid set and more engaging styles since his students were losing interest and dropping off. This, of course, would be pretty crushing to any research. Scott did provide applications despite his discouraging results, showing that he will continue with a more informed research in the future. Overall, Scott was very objective in his self-review, looking for information in spite of what could have been discouraging. In my opinion, his project was a success in that he was able to inform his own practice and will be moving forward from here, with hopefully doing more effective things with improving listening awareness in his classroom, despite not having the results he needed. So my discussion question for y'all this week is that Scott's study included quite a bit of reflection on his own process and where to go from here. What areas do you think that he could refocus on to attain better results? And how can this help with your action research as well? And once again, this was using synthetic phonics to improve listening awareness and accuracy in pre-intermediate learners by Adam Scott in 2015. Thank you all so much for your time. I hope you all enjoy the presentation, and good luck on your presentations.